We need space. Don't contact us. I'm Felix Wilson, and those were the last words my son Brian said to me before hanging up. This happened 3 hours after I watched him offer a $50,000 reward to find his anonymous bone marrow donor, the hero who saved his life 16 years ago, the mysterious stranger he'd been desperately searching for since he was 18. Brian stood at that charity gala podium, voice breaking with emotion, begging 200 medical professionals to help him find this guardian angel. But here's what Brian didn't know as he praised his unknown savior in front of pharmaceutical executives and hospital administrators. The anonymous donor he'd spent 16 years trying to find was standing 20 feet away in a security guard uniform. The same father he'd just told to disappear from his life. The same man he'd introduced as just the security guard an hour earlier. I reached into my jacket and felt the manila envelope I'd carried for 16 years. Time to teach Brian about distance. If you're ready for a story about hidden sacrifices and brutal truth, hit subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. This is how I gave my son exactly the space he asked for, $2 million worth. Let me back up 6 hours to when this all started. I arrived at the Rochester Convention Center at 5 p.m. for my regular security shift. The grand ballroom was transformed with crystal chandeliers and white tablecloths. Each table setting cost more than I make in a week. This was the annual Heroes Among Us charity gala, raising money for the hospital's bone marrow transplant program. Brian worked as a pharmaceutical sales director, made $180,000 a year, lived in a $485,000 colonial in the suburbs with granite countertops and a 3-car garage. Meanwhile, I lived in a 2-bedroom apartment for $850 a month, furnished with hand-me-downs from Goodwill. But tonight wasn't about money. Tonight was about respect. I was checking guest credentials at the main entrance when Brian arrived with his wife, Michelle. She's a pediatric nurse, 31 years old, drives a white BMW, always talks about making a difference in children's lives. Brian wore a $3,200 Hugo Boss tuxedo. I wore my $89 suit from JCPenney. Dad? Brian looked surprised. What are you doing here? Working security for the event. Michelle whispered something to Brian. I caught the words embarrassing and uniform. Brian pulled me aside. Look, Dad, this is a professional networking event. Important people from the pharmaceutical industry will be here. Maybe you could take the night off? I'm scheduled to work. I know, but... He glanced at my navy blue security uniform. The polyester fabric, the magnetic badge, the radio clipped to my belt. These people judge success differently. You understand, right? I understood perfectly. Brian continued, Michelle and I have worked hard to build relationships in the medical community. Tonight I'm giving a speech about finding my bone marrow donor. It's personal, but it's also business. You're an anonymous donor. Right. The person who saved my life when I was 18. We've been searching for 16 years. His voice carried genuine emotion. I want to thank them publicly. Offer a reward. These medical professionals might have connections. I nodded slowly. And me being here makes that awkward. It's not personal, Dad. It's just, you make $32,000 a year as a security guard. These people make 10 times that. They won't understand our family dynamic. Michelle appeared beside us. Brian, we should find our table. Dr. Patterson from Johnson & Johnson wants to meet you. She barely acknowledged me, just a quick nod, like you'd give any service worker. Brian handed me a $20 bill. Why don't you grab dinner somewhere else tonight? My treat. $20. For the man who'd raised him alone after his mother died. For the man who'd worked double shifts when Brian was sick. For the man who'd sacrificed everything to keep him alive. But Brian didn't know about the sacrifices. He didn't know about the manila envelope in my jacket. He didn't know about the documents I'd never shown anyone. He didn't know about October 15th, 2008. Keep your money, I said quietly. Dad, don't be like this. Like what? Stubborn. This is important to me. I looked at my son, really looked at him. The healthy color in his cheeks, the confident posture, the expensive watch on his wrist. All of it possible because of a decision I'd made 16 years ago in a sterile hospital room. I'll stay out of your way, I said. Brian smiled with relief. Thanks, Dad. You understand. But as I watched him walk toward the ballroom with Michelle, I realized something had shifted inside me. The manila envelope felt heavier in my jacket. The secrets I'd kept to protect his pride suddenly felt like chains around my own dignity. What Brian didn't know was that his anonymous hero clocked in at 11 p.m. every night, and tonight that hero was done being invisible. I spent the next hour at my security post, thinking about what staying silent would cost me. The debt, for starters. I still owed $298,000 on the signature loans I'd taken 16 years ago, 12% interest, monthly payments of $3,400. My take-home pay was $2,600 a month. I'd been working 2 additional part-time jobs just to make the payments, leaving me with maybe $300 a month for everything else. No retirement savings, no vacation fund, no emergency cushion. At 62, most people my age were planning their golden years. I was planning which bills to pay late and which jobs to pick up for weekend shifts. All because of October 15th, 2008. That was the day Brian collapsed during his sophomore year at the University of Minnesota. I got the call at work. "Mr. Wilson, your son is in the emergency room. You need to come immediately." Acute lymphoblastic leukemia. Stage 4. The doctors gave him a 15% chance of survival without a bone marrow transplant. With a compatible donor, his odds jumped to 85%. The problem? Finding a match. Brian's name went on the National Bone Marrow Registry. We waited. Days turned into weeks. His condition deteriorated rapidly. The doctors started preparing us for the worst. That's when I made the decision that changed everything. I got tested without telling Brian. The compatibility screening cost $400 I didn't have. I charged it to a credit card that was already maxed out. The results came back on October 28th. Perfect match. 100% compatibility. The doctors were amazed. "This is incredibly rare," Dr. Elizabeth Taylor told me. "Family members usually have a 50% match at best. Your genetic compatibility is essentially identical." But there was a catch. The bone marrow extraction procedure was experimental at the time, risky for donors over 50. Insurance wouldn't cover it for someone my age unless I paid a supplemental premium, $68,000. I didn't have $68,000. I didn't have $6,000. So I took out a signature loan, no collateral except my promise to pay. The interest rate was brutal, but Brian was dying. The procedure happened on November 3rd, 2008. I spent 4 hours on an operating table while doctors extracted bone marrow from my pelvis with hollow needles. The pain was excruciating, but nothing compared to watching your child fade away. Brian's transplant was successful. The bone marrow took hold. His cancer went into remission, but the complications began immediately. Total cost of his treatment over 18 months, $740,000. Insurance covered most of it, but not everything. Not the experimental donor procedure, not the extended hospital stay when complications arose, not the specialized medications that cost $4,000 per injection, not the countless follow-up appointments, not the emergency interventions when his body rejected the transplant twice. I paid $231,000 out of pocket. Added to the original $68,000 for the donor screening, I borrowed $299,000 total, but that wasn't the end of it. Brian's recovery required constant care for 2 years. I couldn't work full-time. I lost my foreman position at the construction company. My annual income dropped from $68,000 to $32,000 overnight. That lost income over 16 years? Another $480,000. With interest compounding over 16 years, my debt had grown to $298,000. Add the lost lifetime earnings, and the total cost of saving Brian's life approached $2 million. Every month for 16 years, I'd made those loan payments, $3,400, without fail. Even when it meant working security at night, stocking shelves on weekends, and delivering newspapers before dawn. Even when it meant eating 1 meal a day. Even when it meant keeping my apartment at 55 degrees in winter. Brian never asked where the money came from. He assumed insurance covered everything. When he started earning good money in pharmaceutical sales, he never offered to help with my obvious financial struggles. He just attributed them to my poor life choices. But the financial cost wasn't the worst part. The worst part was watching my son build a successful life while treating me like a burden. Watching him network with medical professionals while being embarrassed by the man who'd literally given his bone marrow to save his life. If I stayed silent tonight, nothing would change. Brian would continue searching for his anonymous donor, continue offering rewards to find a person who stood right in front of him every day, continue treating me like the family disappointment. The medical community would applaud his gratitude while I remained invisible in my security uniform, and I'd spend the rest of my life making loan payments for a sacrifice that went unrecognized. But if I revealed the truth, everything would change. Brian's image as a self-made success would crumble. His pharmaceutical colleagues would see him differently. The medical professionals he'd tried to impress would know that his life was built on his father's hidden sacrifice. The man he'd called just a security guard would be revealed as the anonymous hero he'd spent 16 years trying to find. I touched the manila envelope again. Inside were the documents that proved everything: the bone marrow donor certificate, the compatibility test results, the loan agreements, the payment receipts, 16 years of evidence that would shatter my son's world. The question was whether I had the courage to use it. As I watched Brian through the ballroom windows, laughing with his pharmaceutical colleagues, I realized the answer. October 15th was the day Brian's old life ended. Tonight would be the day his new understanding began. At 7:30, I was called to handle a minor disturbance near the bar. Nothing serious, just an overly enthusiastic donor trying to bid on auction items he couldn't afford. But it put me right in the middle of Brian's networking circle. I could hear every word. Brian Wilson, Regional Sales Director for Meridian Pharmaceuticals, my son was saying, shaking hands with a woman in a black evening gown. And this is my wife, Michelle, pediatric nurse at Children's Hospital. Impressive, the woman replied. I'm Dr. Sarah Patterson from Johnson & Johnson. We're always looking for talented pharmaceutical professionals. Michelle beamed. Brian's been incredibly successful. Top sales performer 3 years running. Actually, Brian said, lowering his voice, tonight's personal for me. I'm hoping to connect with someone who can help me find my bone marrow donor. Dr. Patterson's expression softened. You're a transplant recipient? Leukemia at 18. Someone saved my life, but they did it anonymously. I've been searching ever since. I stood 6 feet away, adjusting my radio volume, pretending not to listen. How wonderful that you're trying to find them, Dr. Patterson said. Have you tried the National Registry? Everything. Private investigators, social media campaigns, medical database searches. Whoever did this for me disappeared completely. Maybe they had a good reason for staying anonymous, Michelle added. Some people prefer privacy. Brian shook his head. No one saves a stranger's life and wants nothing in return. This person deserves recognition. Probably deserves a lot more than recognition. A pharmaceutical executive in a gray suit joined the conversation. Wilson, right? I heard you offering a reward tonight. $50,000 to anyone with information leading to my donor. The man whistled. Serious money. Serious gratitude, Brian replied. This person gave me everything. My career, my marriage, my future children. I owe them my life. I almost laughed at the irony. Brian was literally describing me while I stood right there in my polyester uniform, invisible to his success story. That's when Michelle noticed me hovering nearby. Excuse me, she said sharply. Is there a security issue here? Just routine patrol, ma'am. Brian turned around. His face flushed when he saw me. Dad, what are you doing? My job. Dr. Patterson looked confused. You two know each other? Brian hesitated. I could see him calculating whether to acknowledge me or pretend we were strangers. This is my father, he said finally. Felix Wilson. The group's energy shifted immediately. Polite smiles became forced. Dr. Patterson's handshake was brief and dismissive. Security, right? The pharmaceutical executive said, glancing at my uniform. Important work. His tone said the opposite. Michelle jumped in quickly. Felix was just checking on things. Weren't you, Felix? Making sure everyone's safe. Well, Dr. Patterson said, we should let you get back to it. Clear dismissal. I was supposed to disappear. Brian's jaw tightened. Dad, we're having a private conversation. About your bone marrow donor. Yes, and? Interesting topic? Why? I shrugged. Just curious about the medical details. The pharmaceutical executive laughed uncomfortably. Probably a bit technical for... He caught himself before finishing the sentence. For what? I asked. Nothing, just medical jargon, you know? Brian stepped closer to me. Dad, please. You're making this awkward. How? You wouldn't understand the medical complexities we're discussing. Michelle nodded. Bone marrow transplants involve sophisticated immunology, HLA typing, compatibility matching, graft versus host disease protocols. She delivered this like she was explaining quantum physics to a child. Sounds complicated, I said. Extremely, Brian agreed. The donor matching process alone requires extensive genetic testing. What kind of testing? Dr. Patterson looked annoyed. Really, this isn't appropriate. Human leukocyte antigen analysis, Brian said impatiently. 6-point compatibility screening. Most family members only match at 3 or 4 points. My donor matched all 6 perfectly. Lucky. Beyond lucky. Dr. Taylor called it a medical miracle. I nodded slowly. Dr. Elizabeth Taylor? Brian looked surprised. You know her? She works at Rochester General. I see her around. Right. Anyway, Dad, we should... Did she explain the donor extraction procedure to you? Why would she need to? I wasn't the donor. But you know how it works? Brian's patience was wearing thin. Large needles extract bone marrow from the donor's pelvis. It's extremely painful and requires general anesthesia. The donor faces significant medical risks, especially if they're older. How old is too old? 50 is the cutoff for most programs. After that, insurance won't cover it without substantial out-of-pocket costs. Michelle added, We're talking $60,000 or more just for the donor procedure. The pharmaceutical executive shook his head. Whoever did this for you really went above and beyond. Exactly, Brian said, which is why I need to find them. I looked at my son, really looked at him. Here he was, describing in perfect detail the sacrifice I'd made for him, while treating me like an unwelcome interruption to his important conversation. Fascinating, I said quietly. Dad, seriously, we're trying to network here. Of course. Sorry to interrupt. I started to walk away, then paused. Brian? What? Good luck finding your donor. Something in my tone made him frown. Thanks. When you do find them, make sure you treat them with the respect they deserve. Before he could respond, I disappeared into the crowd, but I didn't go far. I positioned myself near the auction display tables where I could observe without being obvious. Brian's group resumed their conversation, but I noticed Dr. Patterson glancing in my direction several times. Something about our exchange had caught her attention. Michelle whispered something to Brian that made him look embarrassed. The pharmaceutical executive checked his watch. Dinner should start soon. Perfect timing, Brian said. I'm giving my speech during the main course. His speech, about finding his anonymous donor. I touched the manila envelope one more time. The irony was about to become unbearable. Dinner service began at 8:15. I was stationed near the kitchen entrance, monitoring the catering staff flow, when Dr. Elizabeth Taylor approached me. Felix, she said quietly, I didn't expect to see you here tonight. Working security. She glanced around, making sure no one was listening. This is the Bone Marrow Donor Appreciation Gala. I know. Your son Brian is the featured speaker. So I heard. Dr. Taylor studied my face. She'd been Brian's hematologist 16 years ago. She'd overseen his entire treatment. She'd also been present for every step of the donor evaluation process. She knew. How are you feeling? She asked. Fine. Really? I met her eyes. Never better. Felix, if there's anything you want to discuss, about what? About tonight. About Brian's speech. About the circumstances. I adjusted my radio. Not sure what you mean, Doc. She lowered her voice. I still have all the medical records from 2008. The compatibility tests, the donor paperwork, everything. Good for you. Including the signed consent forms. I said nothing. The donor identification numbers are still active in the registry. BMR 847291. That was my number. The bone marrow registry identification assigned to me 16 years ago. Dr. Taylor was telling me she could trace everything back to me with a single database search. Interesting number, I said. Very specific number. Very traceable number. A waiter bumped into me carrying a tray of salad plates. I stepped aside, but Dr. Taylor stayed close. Felix, I've been in medicine for 35 years. I've seen a lot of family dynamics, some healthy, some complicated. And sometimes the right thing to do is speak up. About what? About the truth. I looked toward the ballroom where Brian was probably rehearsing his speech in his head. 200 medical professionals would soon applaud his search for an anonymous hero. The irony was thick enough to cut with a surgical scalpel. Dr. Taylor, can I ask you something? Of course. In your medical opinion, how does a son search for 16 years for someone he sees every week? She blinked. I'm sorry? Brian visits me twice a month for family dinners. How does someone look that hard for a person sitting across the dinner table? Maybe he doesn't know where to look. Or maybe he doesn't want to find them. Dr. Taylor frowned. What do you mean? Think about it. Brian's built his entire identity around being saved by a mysterious stranger, the grateful survivor, the man whose life was transformed by an anonymous gift. It's a compelling story. It's the truth. Part of the truth. But what happens to that story if the mysterious stranger turns out to be his father? The security guard he's embarrassed to introduce to his pharmaceutical friends? Dr. Taylor was quiet for a moment. It becomes a different story. A more complicated story. A story where the hero isn't mysterious or distant. A story where the hero is just a regular guy who sacrificed everything and asks for nothing in return except basic respect. Felix, a story where the grateful survivor has been ungrateful for 16 years. She nodded slowly. I see your point. Do you? You're saying Brian might unconsciously prefer not to find his donor. I'm saying Brian likes the idea of a mysterious benefactor more than the reality of an ordinary father. A hospital administrator walked past us, heading toward the ballroom. Dr. Taylor waited until he was out of earshot. What are you going to do? She asked. My job. Felix, if you're thinking about what? About revealing the truth tonight, in front of all these people, you need to be careful. Brian's reputation, his career. What about my reputation? What about my career? You're a security guard. Exactly. I'm just a security guard. What could I possibly know about bone marrow transplants? Dr. Taylor looked uncomfortable. That's not what I meant. Isn't it? She started to respond, then stopped. We both knew what she'd meant. I checked my watch. 8:25. Brian's speech would begin in 20 minutes. Dr. Taylor? Yes? If someone asked you to verify bone marrow donor records from 2008, could you do that? Hypothetically? Hypothetically. Yes, the database is still active. All donor identifications are permanently archived. Good to know. Felix, please think carefully about whatever you're considering. I have been, for 16 years. I walked away before she could respond, but I noticed she didn't return to the ballroom immediately. She stood in the hallway for several minutes, staring at her phone, probably deciding whether to make a call, whether to warn Brian, whether to prepare the database search that would confirm everything. The first seed was planted. At 8:45, the dinner service was in full swing. I was monitoring the main ballroom when the evening's program began. Ladies and gentlemen, the MC announced, please welcome our keynote speaker, Mr. Brian Wilson. Applause filled the room. 200 medical professionals, pharmaceutical executives, and hospital administrators turned their attention to the podium where my son stood in his expensive tuxedo. I positioned myself at the back of the ballroom, barely visible in the shadows. Thank you, Brian began, his voice carrying clearly through the sound system. 16 years ago, I was 18 years old and dying. The room fell silent. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia. The doctors gave me a 15% chance of survival. My father and I were told to prepare for the worst. He gestured toward the audience. Many of you work in oncology. You understand what those numbers mean. You've delivered that news to families. You've seen the fear in their eyes. Murmurs of recognition rippled through the crowd. But then something miraculous happened. Someone, somewhere, decided my life was worth saving. A complete stranger underwent a painful, risky medical procedure to donate their bone marrow. They did it anonymously. They asked for nothing in return. Brian's voice grew stronger. That anonymous donor gave me everything. They gave me my career in pharmaceutical sales, working with the same medical community that saved my life. They gave me my marriage to Michelle, a pediatric nurse who shares my passion for helping sick children. They gave me the possibility of future children who will never know their grandfather died young. My grandfather died young, Brian was talking about his maternal grandfather, who'd passed away from cancer when Brian was 5. But he'd forgotten about the other grandfather, the one standing 20 feet away. For 16 years, I've searched for this person, Brian continued. I've hired private investigators. I've contacted every bone marrow registry in North America. I've posted on social media, hoping someone somewhere knows who saved my life. The audience was completely engaged. Several people were wiping their eyes. Tonight, I'm making one final appeal. If you know anything at all, about the anonymous donor who saved Brian Wilson in November 2008 at Rochester General Hospital, please come forward. He paused for effect. I'm offering a $50,000 reward for information leading to this person's identity. Not because I want to violate their privacy, but because gratitude demands acknowledgement. Because heroes deserve recognition. The applause was thunderous. But here's what troubles me, Brian said, his tone shifting. In my search for this anonymous hero, I've learned something about gratitude that I want to share with you. The room quieted again. True gratitude isn't just about finding someone to thank. It's about recognizing the people around us who contribute to our lives every day. It's about appreciating the ordinary heroes who don't seek recognition. A chill ran down my spine. Was Brian about to acknowledge me? My father, for example, works as a security guard. It's not glamorous work. It doesn't pay well. It doesn't come with prestige or recognition. I felt the blood drain from my face. But my father taught me something important about quiet service, about showing up every day, regardless of recognition, about doing your job with dignity, even when the world doesn't notice. Several people in the audience turned to look toward the back of the room, trying to spot the father Brian was describing. Now, I'll be honest with you. Sometimes I've been embarrassed by my father's circumstances. Sometimes I've wished he'd achieved more conventional success. Sometimes I've introduced him as just a security guard instead of my father who raised me alone after my mother died. The room was completely silent now. But tonight, searching for my anonymous donor, I realized something. The greatest gifts often come from the most unexpected sources. The most profound sacrifices are often made by the most ordinary people. My hands were shaking. Brian was building toward something, but I couldn't tell what. So while I continue searching for the stranger who saved my life, I want to publicly acknowledge my father, Felix Wilson. Dad, are you here tonight? Every head in the room turned toward me. 200 pairs of eyes focused on the security guard in the polyester uniform. I raised my hand slightly. There he is, Brian said, pointing in my direction. The man who worked 3 jobs to pay for my college. The man who slept in hospital waiting rooms during my treatment. The man who never missed a doctor's appointment, never complained about the bills, never gave up hope. The audience began applauding again, but it felt different, polite but distant, the kind of applause you give to acknowledge a touching story before moving on to more important matters. My father may not be the anonymous donor I'm searching for, Brian continued, but he's the everyday hero who made my survival possible. So, Dad, thank you for everything you've done, for everything you continue to do. More applause, but I noticed the pharmaceutical executives were already checking their phones. Dr. Patterson was whispering to her colleague. The medical administrators were glancing at their watches. Brian was using me as a prop, a feel-good anecdote to humanize his story before returning to the real business of finding his mysterious benefactor. Now, Brian said, his tone returning to business, let's talk about how we can work together to solve the mystery that brought us here tonight. He launched into the details of his search efforts, database queries, genetic matching protocols, registry cross-references, the technical aspects that would impress his medical audience. I stood in the shadows, watching my son describe the very procedures I'd undergone to save his life. The donor matching process is incredibly complex, Brian explained. 6-point HLA compatibility is rare, even among family members. The statistical probability of finding a perfect match outside immediate family is approximately 1 in 20,000. Dr. Taylor, sitting at a front table, glanced back at me. She knew the statistics better than anyone. But here's what makes my case unique, Brian continued. The donor was male, between 50 and 60 years old at the time of donation. This age range is extremely unusual for bone marrow donors due to insurance restrictions and medical risks. He was describing me perfectly. Every detail matched. The donor also paid significant out-of-pocket costs for the experimental procedure. We're talking $60,000 to $70,000 minimum. This suggests someone with both extraordinary financial resources and personal motivation. I almost laughed out loud. Financial resources. If only he knew about the $298,000 I still owed. So I'm asking all of you, Brian concluded, to think carefully. Do you know someone who fits this profile? A man in his 50s or 60s in 2008 with the financial means and personal motivation to save a stranger's life? The audience murmured thoughtfully. People were genuinely engaged with the puzzle. Because that person deserves more than my gratitude, Brian said. They deserve recognition from this entire medical community. They deserve to know that their sacrifice created not just one saved life, but a lifetime of service to others. The final applause was sustained and emotional. Brian had delivered exactly what the audience wanted, a compelling mystery with clear stakes and genuine emotion. But as I watched the crowd's reaction, I realized something had crystallized inside me. Brian hadn't just described his anonymous donor, he'd described his father, and he had no idea. The man he'd been searching for 16 years was standing 20 feet away in a security uniform, carrying a manila envelope full of proof. The question was whether Brian really wanted to find him, or whether he preferred the mystery. I was about to give him the answer he didn't know he was dreading. As Brian concluded his speech and returned to his table, the evening's program continued with the charity auction. I remained at my post, watching the crowd bid on vacation packages and signed medical journals. But I noticed Dr. Taylor hadn't returned to her seat. She was standing near the side entrance, speaking quietly into her phone. 10 minutes later, she approached the MC's podium and whispered something in his ear. He nodded and gestured for her to take the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," the MC announced, "we have a special addition to tonight's program. Dr. Elizabeth Taylor, Chief of Hematology at Rochester General Hospital, has asked to share some medical perspective on Mr. Wilson's search." Brian looked surprised but pleased. Having a respected oncologist endorse his cause would add credibility to his reward offer. Dr. Taylor took the podium. She was 68 years old, silver-haired, wearing a black evening gown with a simple pearl necklace. She'd been practicing medicine for 35 years and commanded absolute respect in the room. "Thank you," she began. "I've known Brian Wilson since 2008, when he arrived in my emergency department more dead than alive." The audience settled in for what they expected to be a medical testimony supporting Brian's search. Brian's case was medically fascinating, Dr. Taylor continued. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia in an 18-year-old is aggressive and often fatal. But Brian's case had unique characteristics that made his survival possible. She paused, scanning the room until her eyes found me in the back corner. Most importantly, we found a bone marrow donor with perfect genetic compatibility. 6-point HLA matching. This level of compatibility is extraordinarily rare outside immediate family members. Brian was nodding from his table, assuming Dr. Taylor was building support for his search efforts. The donor was a 54-year-old male, significantly older than our typical donor profile. The procedure required experimental protocols not covered by standard insurance. Dr. Taylor's voice remained clinical and professional, but I could sense she was building toward something. The donor underwent 4 hours of bone marrow extraction under general anesthesia, multiple large-bore needle insertions into the pelvis, significant blood loss, substantial recovery time, and considerable financial cost, $68,000 out of pocket just for the donor procedure itself. The audience was listening intently, but I noticed some confused glances. Why was Dr. Taylor providing such detailed medical information? But here's what made this case truly unique, Dr. Taylor continued. The donor specifically requested complete anonymity, no contact with the recipient, no acknowledgement of the donation, no recognition of any kind. She looked directly at Brian. For 16 years, this person has watched you recover, graduate from college, build a successful career, get married, and establish yourself in the pharmaceutical industry, and they have never sought credit, gratitude, or even acknowledgement. Brian was frowning now. This wasn't the endorsement he'd expected. "Which brings me to tonight's program," Dr. Taylor said. "I've listened to Brian's heartfelt appeal to find his anonymous donor. I've heard his offer of a $50,000 reward. I've watched this community rally around his search efforts. The room was completely silent. And I've realized that sometimes the most profound discoveries happen not through searching, but through seeing what's been in front of us all along. Dr. Taylor set down her prepared notes and spoke directly to the audience. The Bone Marrow Donor Registry maintains permanent records of all donations. Donor identification numbers are never deleted. Medical files are archived indefinitely, which means that if I wanted to, I could identify Brian's donor with a single database query. Brian sat up straighter. Several people at his table leaned forward. The question is whether revealing this information serves justice or violates privacy. She looked around the room, making eye contact with pharmaceutical executives, hospital administrators, and medical professionals. I've struggled with this ethical dilemma for years, but tonight, listening to Brian's speech, I've realized something important. Dr. Taylor's voice grew stronger. Brian spoke eloquently about ordinary heroes who don't seek recognition, about the quiet service of people like his father, who work jobs without prestige or glory, about recognizing the unexpected sources of our greatest gifts. Where was she going with this? Brian also described his donor as someone with extraordinary motivation and significant financial resources, a person willing to undergo a risky procedure and pay substantial out-of-pocket costs to save a stranger's life. She paused, looking directly at Brian. But what if the donor wasn't a stranger? What if the person with extraordinary motivation was someone who loved you more than life itself? Brian's face went pale. What if the person with significant financial resources was actually someone who borrowed money they couldn't afford to pay back? The audience was completely still now. Even the waiters had stopped moving. What if the anonymous donor you've been searching for 16 years wasn't hiding from gratitude, but protecting you from guilt? Dr. Taylor pulled out her phone and opened what appeared to be a medical database. Bone Marrow Donor Registry Number BMR 847291. Donation date November 3rd, 2008. Recipient Brian Michael Wilson. Donor compatibility 100% HLA match across all 6 markers. She looked up from her phone. Donor name Harold James Wilson. Age at time of donation 54. Relationship to recipient father. The room erupted in gasps and murmurs. 200 medical professionals turned as one to stare at me, standing in my security uniform at the back of the ballroom. Brian's mouth fell open. He looked from Dr. Taylor to me and back again, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and dawning horror. "That's impossible," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "My father isn't my donor. My donor is anonymous. My donor is—" He trailed off as the implications hit him. Michelle grabbed his arm. "Brian, what is she talking about?" Dr. Taylor continued reading from her phone. Total cost of donor procedure and associated medical expenses, $68,000 initial donor screening and extraction. Additional out-of-pocket costs for recipient complications, extended treatment, and follow-up care, $231,000. Total family financial obligation, $299,000. She looked directly at me. "Mr. Wilson, do you still have the loan documentation?" Every eye in the room was on me. Pharmaceutical executives, hospital administrators, medical professionals, charity donors. The same people who had politely applauded Brian's touching story about his security guard father were now staring at the security guard who had literally given his bone marrow to save his son's life. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the manila envelope I'd carried for 16 years. The walk from the back of the ballroom to the front felt like miles. My footsteps echoed in the absolute silence. People shifted in their chairs to follow my progress. Some pulled out phones to record what was clearly becoming a viral moment. I reached the podium where Dr. Taylor stood waiting. "Brian," I said quietly, my voice amplified by the microphone, "you wanted to find your anonymous donor." I opened the manila envelope and pulled out the first document. Bone Marrow Donor Identification Card, number BMR 847291, issued November 1st, 2008. I held it up so the audience could see the plastic card, worn from 16 years in my wallet. Compatibility test results. Harold James Wilson, 6-point HLA match with recipient Brian Michael Wilson. Probability of match, less than 1 in 20,000. I set the document on the podium and pulled out the next one. Signed consent form for experimental bone marrow extraction procedure. Donor age 54. Cost $68,000. Payment method, signature loan at 12% interest. Brian was shaking his head. Dad, this isn't real. This is some kind of mistake. Medical discharge summary, November 5th, 2008. Donor recovery, successful. Extraction volume, 1.2 liters of bone marrow. Complications, minor bleeding, expected pain levels. I looked at my son. You want to know what recovery from bone marrow extraction feels like, Brian? Like someone drove railroad spikes through your pelvis. For 6 weeks, I could barely walk, but I was back at work within 10 days because I couldn't afford to take time off. The audience was completely silent. Some people were crying. Bank loan agreement, the principal amount, $68,000. Interest rate, 12% annually. Term, 15 years. Monthly payment, $738. I pulled out a thick stack of payment receipts. But that was just the beginning. When complications arose during your recovery, insurance didn't cover everything. Experimental medications, $18,000. Extended hospital stay, $45,000. Specialized follow-up care, $32,000. Additional consultant fees, $28,000. Emergency interventions when your body rejected the transplant twice, $108,000. Michelle whispered, "Oh my God." Second bank loan, principal amount, $231,000. Interest rate, 12% annually. Term, 25 years. Monthly payment, $2,662. I set the loan documents on the podium in neat stacks. Combined monthly payments, $3,400. For 16 years, every month, without fail. I pulled out the most recent payment stub. Current remaining balance on both loans, $298,000. But that's not the whole story. I pulled out another document. Lost income calculation. When you got sick, I had to drop from full-time foreman to part-time security work. Annual income reduction, $36,000. Over 16 years, $576,000. The silence in the room was deafening. Add the interest, the lost lifetime earnings, and the ongoing costs. Total sacrifice for saving your life, just over $2 million. Brian was staring at the documents like they were written in a foreign language. Dad, why didn't you tell me? You never asked. But I've been searching, Papete, for a stranger. You've been searching for a mysterious benefactor who could enhance your story. You never looked for your father. I pulled out the final document. Hospital bills, insurance statements, payment schedules, 16 years of financial documentation. Total cost of your life, $2,043,612, including interest, fees, and ongoing payments through 2031. Dr. Taylor stepped forward. Ladies and gentlemen, you've just witnessed something unprecedented. A son unknowingly offering a reward to find the father who bankrupted himself to save his life. The audience began murmuring, but I held up my hand. Brian, you stood at that podium 20 minutes ago and described your anonymous donor perfectly. Male between 50 and 60 at the time of donation, willing to pay significant out-of-pocket costs. Motivated by extraordinary circumstances. I gestured to myself in my security uniform. You described me. You just didn't recognize the description. Brian's voice was barely a whisper. Why didn't you tell me? Because you built your entire identity around being saved by a stranger. The grateful survivor. The man transformed by an anonymous gift. What happens to that story when the stranger turns out to be your embarrassing father? I looked around the room at the medical professionals who had watched this unfold. Tonight, you introduced me as just a security guard to people you wanted to impress. You suggested I leave before the important people arrived. You handed me $20 and told me to get dinner somewhere else. My voice remained calm, but every word carried 16 years of quiet dignity. Your anonymous hero clocks in at 11 p.m. every night. Your mysterious benefactor works 3 jobs to make loan payments. Your guardian angel makes $32,000 a year and will be paying off your medical bills until he's 79 years old. I gathered the documents and put them back in the manila envelope. Brian, I gave you life twice. Once at birth, and once at 18 when I donated my bone marrow. I'm done giving. I looked at Dr. Taylor. Thank you for having the courage to tell the truth. Then I walked off the stage, through the stunned audience, and out of the ballroom. Behind me, I could hear the chaos beginning. Voices rising, phones ringing, chairs scraping as people stood to get a better view of Brian's reaction. But I didn't look back. I had carried that envelope for 16 years, waiting for the right moment to reveal its contents. Tonight was that moment, and for the first time in 16 years, I felt truly free. I made it to the parking lot before Brian caught up with me. "Dad, wait!" I turned around. My son was running across the asphalt in his expensive tuxedo, still clutching his speech notes. Behind him, I could see people streaming out of the convention center. Some were following to witness the confrontation. Others were probably calling reporters. "Dad, please, we need to talk about this." "What's to talk about?" "Everything. Why didn't you tell me? Why did you let me search for 16 years? Why did you embarrass me in front of 200 people? I looked at my son, really looked at him. The healthy color in his cheeks that came from bone marrow that had grown in my body, the confident posture that came from never having to worry about medical bills, the expensive watch that cost more than my monthly loan payment. "I embarrassed you? You know what I mean." "No, Brian, I don't." Michelle appeared beside him, slightly out of breath. "Felix, what you did in there was cruel. Brian has been grateful for his donor his entire adult life." "Has he?" "Of course he has." "Really? Because I've been sitting at your dinner table twice a month for 8 years, listening to Brian talk about his mysterious benefactor. Not once has he expressed gratitude for the man sitting across from him." Brian ran his hands through his hair. "Dad, I had no idea." "That's the problem. You had no idea because you never wanted to know." "That's not fair." "Isn't it?" "Brian, answer one question honestly. If you had known your anonymous donor was your father, would you have offered that $50,000 reward tonight?" Brian hesitated. That hesitation told me everything. "Would you have spent 16 years searching for him?" "Dad, would you have called him your hero in front of 200 medical professionals?" Brian's silence was answer enough. I pulled out my phone and opened my banking app. "Since we're being honest tonight, let me show you something else." I turned the screen toward Brian and Michelle. "My checking account balance, $437. My savings account balance, 0. My retirement account balance, 0. I scrolled to the next screen. Outstanding loan balance, $298,000. Monthly payment due, November 15th, $3,400. Michelle's face went pale. "Felix, we had no idea your finances were what? Destroyed?" "Yeah, well, bone marrow extractions are expensive when you're over 50 and insurance won't cover experimental procedures." Brian looked genuinely stricken. "Dad, if I had known, you would have what? Offered to help with the payments? Because you've seen me struggle financially for years, Brian. You've seen me wear the same clothes, drive the same old car, work multiple jobs. You never once asked if I needed help. I thought you preferred living simply." "I thought you were just bad with money," Michelle added quietly. I almost laughed. "Bad with money?" "Right. Actually, I'm great with money. I just happened to spend $2 million of it keeping my son alive." Dr. Taylor approached our group, along with several other medical professionals from the gala. Word was spreading quickly. "Mr. Wilson," Dr. Taylor said, "I want to apologize for revealing your identity without permission. But I felt the medical community needed to understand the full scope of parental sacrifice." "Don't apologize. It was time." A hospital administrator I didn't recognize stepped forward. "Mr. Wilson, what you did was extraordinary. The financial costs alone, $2 million, were necessary," I said simply. "When your child is dying, you don't calculate cost-benefit ratios. You do whatever it takes." Brian was staring at his phone. "Dad, I'm looking at bone marrow donation statistics. The survival rate for donors over 50, the complication risks. Were significant, I know. Dr. Taylor explained everything before the procedure." "But you did it anyway." "Of course I did it anyway. You're my son." More people were gathering around us. I could see phones recording. This was going to be all over social media within hours. Brian looked up from his phone. "The $50,000 reward? Keep it. Dad, please. Let me pay off your loans. Let me—" "With what money?" "I make good money. Michelle and I can—" "Brian, you make $180,000 a year. Your house payment is $4,000 a month. Your car payments are $1,200 a month. Michelle's student loans are $800 a month. You live comfortably, but you don't have $300,000 lying around." He looked shocked that I knew his financial details. I pay attention, Brian. I know exactly what your life costs. And I know you can't afford to pay off loans you didn't know existed. Then what do you want from me? The question hung in the air. What did I want? I thought about it for a moment. 16 years of hidden sacrifice. 16 years of being treated like the family disappointment. 16 years of sitting at dinner tables while my son praised his anonymous savior. I want you to understand something, I said finally. I didn't donate my bone marrow to gain your gratitude. I didn't sacrifice my financial future to earn your respect. I did it because I love you. Brian's eyes filled with tears. Dad, but love has limits, Brian. And tonight you reached mine. I pulled out my car keys. Here's what's going to happen. I'm going home to my 2-bedroom apartment. You're going back to your $4,000 a month house. And we're going to think about whether we want to rebuild our relationship on honesty instead of illusions. What does that mean? It means no more family dinners where you complain about your father's limited life choices. No more introducing me as just a security guard to people you want to impress. No more pretending that your success happened in a vacuum. I looked at Michelle. And no more suggestions that I don't understand complex medical topics. I understand bone marrow transplants better than most oncologists. I lived through one. Brian wiped his eyes. Dad, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I know you are. The question is whether you're sorry enough to change. I started walking toward my 15-year-old Honda. Behind me, I could hear the crowd discussing what they'd just witnessed. Medical professionals who had seen every kind of family drama were shaking their heads in amazement. Dad, Brian called after me, what about Thanksgiving? What about Christmas? I stopped and turned around one last time. Brian, for 16 years, I've been the anonymous donor in your life. Giving without recognition, sacrificing without acknowledgement, loving without appreciation. I got in my car and rolled down the window. Maybe it's time you learned what it feels like to search for someone you lost through your own choices. I drove away, leaving Brian standing in the parking lot with 200 witnesses to the night his perfect story fell apart. For the first time in 16 years, I felt like the hero of my own life. The story went viral within 6 hours. I woke up Saturday morning to 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. Someone had posted video of the revelation on TikTok. The hashtag now $2 million dad was trending on Twitter. Local news stations were calling for interviews. But the real consequences were just beginning. By Monday morning, Brian's situation had deteriorated rapidly. The pharmaceutical industry is small, and word travels fast when someone's character is publicly questioned. Dr. Patterson from Johnson & Johnson called Brian's supervisor, not to complain but to ask pointed questions about Brian's integrity. If he could spend 16 years searching for a father he saw twice a month, what did that say about his attention to detail? His awareness of his surroundings, his ability to process information accurately? 3 major pharmaceutical accounts requested different sales representatives, not because they thought Brian was dishonest, but because they felt uncomfortable working with someone whose judgment seemed questionable. Brian's mortgage became a more immediate problem than my loan payments. When he'd applied for the $485,000 house loan, he'd listed me as a co-signer, not because he needed help qualifying, but because it reduced his interest rate by 0.5 percentage point. Over 30 years, that saved him approximately $40,000. I called the bank Tuesday morning. I'd like to remove myself as co-signer on loan number 404729118. I'm sorry, sir, but co-signer removal requires either full loan payoff or refinancing with qualifying income verification. What happens if the co-signer withdraws permission? The loan becomes immediately callable. The borrower has 30 days to either pay in full or secure alternative financing. I thought about 16 years of $3,400 monthly payments, about working 3 jobs until 79 to pay off loans for a son who was embarrassed to introduce me to his colleagues. Please begin the co-signer removal process. Sir, this will likely trigger... I understand the consequences. Brian called me that afternoon, panicked. Dad, the bank says our house loan is being called. They want the full balance in 30 days, or they'll initiate foreclosure proceedings. That's unfortunate. Dad, we can't lose our house. Then you better find alternative financing. I've tried. Without your co-signature, our debt-to-income ratio doesn't qualify for current interest rates. The new monthly payment would be $7,000. We can't afford that. I was sitting in my small apartment, looking at my own stack of loan documents. 16 years of payments for a son who'd called me just a security guard. Brian, what did you tell your pharmaceutical friends about your mortgage situation? What do you mean? I mean, are you embarrassed that your father co-signed your house loan? Does that fit the narrative about your self-made success? Silence on the other end. Because here's something interesting, Brian. You built your entire professional identity around being saved by an anonymous stranger. But your house, your car, your lifestyle, all of that was co-signed by your father. Dad, please. The same father you introduced as just a security guard to people you wanted to impress. I said I was sorry. Sorry doesn't fix destroyed credit, Brian. Sorry doesn't pay back borrowed money. Sorry doesn't rebuild 16 years of sacrificed dignity. Michelle got on the phone. Felix, you're being vindictive. Brian made a mistake, but destroying our financial future won't solve anything. I'm not destroying anything, Michelle. I'm simply stopping my participation in Brian's financial success. Just like he stopped his participation in my emotional well-being. The local newspaper ran a follow-up story Wednesday morning. Security guard's $2 million secret. The hidden cost of saving your child's life. The article included financial details, medical records, and interviews with Dr. Taylor. It painted me as a working-class hero who'd bankrupted himself to save his ungrateful son. The pharmaceutical industry noticed. Brian's company called him into a meeting Thursday afternoon. Not to fire him, but to discuss the public relations implications of recent events. His sales territory was being restructured. His commission structure was being reevaluated. His professional future was being reassessed. That evening, Brian showed up at my apartment. Dad, I've been thinking about what you said, about rebuilding our relationship on honesty. And? I want to try, but I need to ask you something first. What? Do you want me to lose everything, my house, my job, my marriage? I looked at my son, the healthy young man whose life I'd saved twice. Once at birth, once at 18. The successful professional who'd forgotten where his success came from. Brian, I want you to understand something. I didn't sacrifice $2 million to control your life. I sacrificed it because I love you. Then help me save my house. No. Dad? Brian, for 16 years you've lived with the consequences of my sacrifice without knowing it. Now you get to live with the consequences of your choices while knowing exactly what they cost. I opened my door. When you're ready to have an honest relationship with your father, instead of a convenient one, call me. What if it's too late by then? Then you'll learn what I learned 16 years ago. Sometimes love means accepting permanent consequences for temporary decisions. Brian left without another word, but as I watched him drive away in his BMW, I realized something important. I wasn't angry anymore. For the first time in 16 years, my son knew exactly who I was and what I'd done for him. Whether he chose to honor that knowledge was his decision. I'd done my part. 3 weeks later, Brian called. Dad, it's me. I know. Can we talk? We're talking. I mean in person. At your apartment. I'll bring coffee. All right. He arrived an hour later with 2 cups from the expensive coffee shop downtown. $5 each. $10 for coffee. I calculated automatically 1/3 of my daily food budget, but I didn't say anything. Brian looked around my small apartment like he was seeing it for the first time. The second-hand furniture, the 13-inch television, the card table I used for eating, the stack of medical bills on the kitchen counter. Dad, I lost the house, I figured. The bank foreclosed last Friday. Michelle and I are staying with her parents until we find a rental we can afford. I sipped my expensive coffee. How's work? I'm on probation, reduced territory, smaller commission structure. My supervisor says it's temporary, but everyone knows what that means. What does it mean? It means I'm probably going to lose my job within 6 months. Brian sat down across from me at the card table. Michelle's parents think I should sue you, claim emotional distress or something. What do you think? I think they don't understand what you did for me. I waited. Dad, I've been reading about bone marrow donations. The risks for donors over 50, the failure rates, the complications, and you had a 30% chance of serious complications, 15% chance of permanent disability, 3% chance of death. Dr. Taylor explained all that before the procedure. But you did it anyway. Yes. Brian was quiet for a long moment. Why? Because you're my son. No, I mean, why did you hide it? Why didn't you tell me what it cost? Why did you let me search for 16 years? I thought about how to answer that. Because I wanted you to have a normal life, without guilt. Without feeling obligated to your father for something you didn't ask for. But I ended up obligated anyway, just to the wrong person. What do you mean? I spent 16 years feeling grateful to a stranger, building my identity around being saved by someone I'd never met, living with this incredible debt I could never repay. Brian looked directly at me, when I could have spent 16 years being grateful to my father. For the first time since the gala, I felt something shift inside my chest. Dad, I know I can't fix the financial damage. I know I can't give you back 16 years of recognition, but I want to try something different. What? I want to start over. With honesty this time. Brian reached across the table and put his hand on mine. Hi, Dad. I'm Brian Wilson. You saved my life, and I've spent 16 years taking you for granted. I'd like to learn how to be a better son. I looked at this man I'd raised alone, this successful professional whose life I'd preserved with bone marrow that grew in my body, this son who'd finally learned the difference between gratitude and acknowledgement. Nice to meet you, Brian. I'm Felix Wilson. I'm your father, and I've spent 16 years loving you more than my own life. I'd like to learn how to be proud of you again. We shook hands across my card table like strangers meeting for the first time. But for the first time in 16 years, we both knew exactly who we were. That was 3 months ago. Brian visits every Sunday now. He brings groceries, not coffee. He asks about my loan payments and my retirement plans. He introduces me to his new friends as my father who saved my life. He hasn't found a new job yet, but he's stopped looking for mysterious benefactors. Sometimes the people who love you most are hiding in plain sight. Has anyone in your family ever surprised you with hidden sacrifices? Let me know in the comments below.